to episode 3 of Coffee and Conversation with Dr. Doom. That's me. And I'm joined today with my friend and my colleague, Dr. Daniela Melo. Hello, Daniela.
Hi, Sean. Thank you for having me.
I'm thrilled that you're here. I really appreciate you taking the time. So for everyone, before we go any further, everyone should know that this is Sunday, November 1st. So we do not know the outcome of the election. And I dare say that we're both still sick to our stomachs. Is that a fair statement?
I would say so.
Yeah. So we're gonna look at the Electoral College map at the end as we're wrapping up our conversation, but we'll get to that. One of the reasons that I was really excited to have coffee and conversation with Daniela is that Daniela grew up in Portugal, and she's a political scientist, and she's been spending a lot of time on Portuguese media. And so I wanted to hear a little bit about that. But before we get to that, Daniela, let's talk a little bit about the political atmosphere that you grew up in Portugal, as opposed to what I grew up here. And for those who don't know, Portugal had a dictatorship until 1974. Is that the right year? And they transitioned back to democracy. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about that too. So, you know, what was your growing up when you did? What was the political atmosphere like?
The political atmosphere. So I was born in 1981, and you could say that I was raised during the period of democratic consolidation, right? That period in which a new democracy is still trying to learn the ropes of how to function, right? Yeah. New institutions are still sort of flexing their new muscles. But Portugal was very lucky in some ways, right? I mean, the context was right. Portugal had a revolution between 74 and 76. It's a 2-year revolutionary process. And what's really extraordinary about the Portuguese case is that unlike most revolutionary processes, it did not end up having a government, like it had a good outcome for the population. It became a democracy.
Nice. It actually worked.
which is actually a rare outcome for revolutionary processes, right? I mean, we can look at the Arab Spring and see how the majority of the states that went through revolution ended up as the only partially successful case is Tunisia, perhaps. Yeah. So Portugal is one of those, right? Yeah. And thank God, thank goodness for me, because it meant that I had a radically different childhood from the one that my parents had had, and certainly from the one that my grandparents had had. So one of the things that when I get to talk about this topic of revolutionary process in Portugal, whether it's in the class or elsewhere, one of the things I like to remind students is that because of our dictatorship in Portugal, we were stuck in time. You know, my grandparents on one side were pretty much peasants, living not too differently from the peasants that we talk about in class in Russia and in China, you know, when we teach those topics. And out of my 4 grandparents, only one knows how to read and write.
Wow.
Right? Like illiteracy was completely rampant. So the chances that I, the granddaughter of farmers and peasants who were almost completely illiterate, and as a woman had the chance to study, to dream about going to university, to become a doctor, to study, you know, whatever my heart's desire, that's really a story of the revolution for me. And I kind of always understood it like that. Without that revolution, my path would not have been possible at all, right? I mean, my parents have a 4th grade education. So it was an incredible jump socially. It was an incredible jump educationally. It was an earthquake for women in terms of rights.
So, all right, so 2 questions I have. How long did the dictatorship last? And was it a dictatorship that was fascist or socialist, or what sort of authoritarianism did they use?
So it was I would call it a personalistic, right-wing, conservative, Catholic dictatorship, if those are enough labels.
Yeah.
Our dictator came to power in the 20s, but he really consolidated his power in the early 1930s when he oversaw a constitutional revision that ensured, you know, that he would stay in power. His name was Salazar. And so you can imagine my oldest grandmother, who's no longer alive, but she was born in 1920. So she was just a teenager. Well, she was a child, right, when Salazar came to power. So she grew, and my other grandmother was born in the 30s. She only knew, these were people that only knew the dictatorship for most of their lives, right, and were in their 50s and 60s when the revolution finally came. Right. Portugal was a country that, remained vastly agrarian during this period. But in the 1960s, we were involved in 3 different wars overseas in territories that were occupied by the Portuguese, that were colonies, and that were trying to gain their independence from Portugal. So while the United States was fighting in Vietnam, the Portuguese, which are a much smaller country at the time, about 8 million people, were fighting wars in Guinea, Angola, and Mozambique. Wow. So we also had a deeply radicalized generation in a way. By radicalized, I mean radicalized by the war and by the experience of war. Because everyone had someone in the war front when you're a country of 8 million and you have 3 different war fronts.
Yeah. Wow.
Sorry, I'm telling you too much information, perhaps.
No, it's so fascinating to me. And in listening to what you were talking about, so here, I didn't know that we would be able to have this sort of contrast I'm going to now make. Mm-hmm. But you were talking about how you went from this sort of bad situation and you jumped into a good one in 1974 to 76. So here's the difference. Now, I was born 10 years earlier than you. I was born in 1971. Nixon was president. Mm-hmm. And it is Nixon and the Nixon administration that pursued the Southern strategy, mm-hmm, that flipped the Republican Party from the more progressive to the radical conservative party, or the beginning of it, and the evangelical party. Mm. So, and it was like the first fruition of that was 1972, when he wins the largest landslide in history. So for me, I grew up at the beginning of the decline. So I was born at the moment where the baby boomers were just about to sell out to the Wall Street interests and to the tax cuts, right? So they were only a few years away from that. And it's, and that unfortunately flowed in part from the failure of Jimmy Carter. Mm. And, there's no better person on the whole planet than Jimmy Carter. There's no better person. And he was such a lousy president. And his failure opened the way for Reagan and this so-called Reagan Revolution. And so I grew up in the late phase, wacko propaganda phase, where the propaganda is now propping up a man who doesn't know what he's talking about. And the people around him know he doesn't know what he's talking about. And much of the population knows that he doesn't really know what he's talking about. And yet everybody decided to go along with it. And, I did too. And so I joke with my students. I tell them, I was a Reaganite, but I was 12. So I forgive myself.
Where did you grow up, Sean? What state?
Massachusetts. and Massachusetts had this reputation of being this radical left-wing, because they voted against Nixon, right? I mean, and that's, once you get outside of Boston, that is not what Massachusetts is.
Well, Massachusetts can actually be quite diverse politically.
Absolutely, yeah, in the whole spectrum. I mean, the whole spectrum, and from from the communists in Cambridge to the libertarians in Amherst or whatever. So it's interesting. I suddenly, as you're talking, I thought, wow, I was growing up in the opposite. I was growing up at the end stage, where the things just get crazier and crazier, and and now, of course, I'll be 50 in April, and we get to the dead end of Trump, and the dead end of what the lies brought to us, and the nonsense and the hatred and the dehumanization and all of that. And all of it, the thing that really enrages me, all of it was just a cover for neoliberal economics.
Well, I think you're right that there are interesting contrasts here, but perhaps something, well, I don't know if it was similar or not, but like I remember the 1980s and the 1990s as like, it never looked like the world would get worse. Everything seemed to be at least in my perspective, in a good trajectory, right? Because I entered elementary school in 87 and Portugal became a member of the European Union. Well, it wasn't European Union yet in 86, right? So I am really that first generation of Portuguese people that see themselves as Europeans, right? Yeah. Which was a very big transition. And I have very vivid memories of, at the time, they were teaching us about the European Union, what it would be like, what it would mean for all of us, right? And I remember right into the 90s, right, when we started talking about having a single monetary, creating the euro, right, yeah. Having a monetary union. And there were already prototypes of what the euro would look like and, the European themes it would have. And I remember seeing slides of that at school, right? And groups coming, to talk to us about how great this new world was going to be. Like my very first political memory, which is one that it's a question I often ask of my students as an icebreaker in the first class, is the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? I mean, that to me, that's completely engraved as, something that was political, was big. And I just remembered I remember mostly the emotion in people's faces as that wall was coming down. I had no idea what was truly going on because I was too young, right? But I remember just how happy people looked. And
let me interject for 1 second because I have to tell you my Berlin Wall story now.
Please do, please do.
So I was an ardent Reaganite, an ardent anti-communist. And 1989 was a great year because those authoritarian regimes collapsed and it was mostly peaceful, right? And that was a remarkable thing. And I do remember the optimism was unbelievable. I mean, that year was just such a, you're right. So I worked on my college newspaper and that was my freshman year, was the fall of 1989. So I was in the newspaper office the day that the Berlin Wall came down, and I was standing at the telex machine. I just happened to be standing there. And it starts, no one's gonna remember a telex machine, but it's like a typewriter and a fax machine. And so it starts typing out. And so I just went, I went to look at it. And it said, Dateline Berlin, November 5th, I guess, 1989, the Berlin Wall is open. And that was all it said. And that's all it had to say, I kicked myself because I didn't save that piece of paper.
Right.
But anyway, I'm sorry for interrupting. You were talking about the optimism of that.
No, I think that was actually a great segue in that, like, the way I remember my childhood in the 80s in Portugal it was a childhood full of promise, and the world was full of promise, and there was great, great optimism. And the first time I remember feeling afraid, in fact, it was a couple of years later with the invasion of Iraq. And I do remember, this is, if I may, just one more memory, but
please.
I remember watching the news with my father. I remember my teacher teaching us I was in 4th grade, and I remember my teacher teaching us how to spell Saddam Hussein on the board, right? Yeah. And because Portuguese don't do like double consonants, except for double S, and a couple others. But Saddam Hussein, I remember that, like, the teacher writing it in big letters on the board. And then at night, I remember watching a big map of Europe and the Middle East, and they were showing in the evening news where Iraq was. And I just remember thinking, wow, I'm so lucky to live at the other end of Europe, because that looks very far away. They would have to go through all of those countries before they got to us. So I'm okay. Which is kind of odd, but children looking at wars, right? But I do remember sort of a changing tone there about, I mean, it was really an augur of the type of destabilization we would continue to see, through the 1990s up to 9/11 and whatnot.
Yeah, it's you know, it was such a for a year, people talked about the peace dividend, and then Iraq invaded Kuwait, and that was it. And we were back to now. And you know, I try to explain to my students that look, the Cold War was a trick, right? That was just a trick by the people at the top of the Soviet Union and the rich people in the United States to keep the rest of us hating each other so that we would keep throwing money up. That's all it was. It was a trick. Well, then that failed, right? The trick ended because the Soviets quit. So what's the new trick? What's the new cover story? Well, it's the war on terrorism. And the great thing about the war on terrorism is it never had to end, because how do you end terrorism, right? And it was just another cover story for, you know, to make sure that the people below the ruling classes of both countries, to make sure we all hate each other, because that's how they make money is, you know. And I always tell people, if I ever won an office, an elective office like president or something, right? The first thing I would say is throw down your weapons, because you're shooting at the wrong people. Your enemy is never in front of you. Your enemy is above you. And it's a trick, you know, and throw down those weapons. But anyway, I'm dying to know. You've been doing a phenomenal job with connecting with Portuguese media. And I really would love for you to tell us, like, what are they asking you about this election in 2020? What are they thinking? What is their viewpoint?
They're asking all sorts of things. The first set of interviews I did, there were a lot of interviews about the polls. I think the entire world is having a bit of PTSD aftershocks after 2016. So there were a lot of questions about, can we really trust the polls? You know, have they been adjusted in ways that, you know, we won't see the same sort of mistake as last time? And you know, so a lot of interest about polling and about. I can tell you that everyone follows 538, even across the pond. Right?
I bet. That's the place to go, 538.com.
Exactly, because 538 is giving and is providing polling that is state by state, which is really what you need to look at if you want to understand the United States.
Right.
Like polling in the United States at the national level is very good at telling us the preferences of the American people. But because of the structure of the electoral system in the United States and the Electoral College, you know, all the things that we've talked about several times, polls, you know, national polls tell us nothing about who's actually going to win. So you really have to look state by state, and you really have to look at those states that are, you know, our new purple states for this election, which
yeah.
is on the list.
You know, that, and one of my objections, and I think that this is something that, like, we as citizens should really pressure the media on. I object to showing states as red or blue. They should all be shades of purple, you know, and that would be a better reflection, because it really, like, I really object to people who like, I'm going to vote blue, or this is a blue, like, no, it's not, you know, like, let's stop talking about colors, because I really wish that the map would blend, you know, would blend those shades. I think that would be a much better representation, and it would help to sort of step down the stupid tribal nonsense that has just engulfed this country, right? And that's what happens. I mean, you know, what I try to talk to the students about is this: when a system is failing, as our system has failed, the ruling class has to deflect blame onto somebody else. And so it's libtards, or it's this, or it's Muslims, or it's transgendered people, or it's anybody but them. And, you know, that's why I keep saying, like, you've got to understand your enemy is above you. They are the people that are profiting on, you know, making you hate this person or that person. It's really important that they see this.
That has really been one of those topics as well. One of the topics that are garnering a lot of attention outside of the United States is polarization, right? You know, what are the fracturing lines between, this is one of the questions that I've gotten in a number of ways. What are the big fractures in American society? What are the big cleavages? Yeah. And are they surmountable? Are the differences surmountable? Right. Which is a hard question to answer, because this is indeed a highly polarizing moment. You can look at all sorts of political indicators, but I think it was just yesterday I was listening on NPR how dating apps, right? The most likely, how did they put it? I think it was that, you know, people are now more polarized on dating apps than they had ever been since the history of dating apps, right? There's more people saying, I want to know exactly who you're voting for and what party you support, and deciding who they're even willing to see and talk to on the basis of, you know, political choices, political preferences.
Yeah, yeah.
It is indeed a highly polarized society right now. Our media has helped to contribute to that over the past few years, I think. I think to go back to your point about just showing states as red or blue, perhaps, I don't know if that's what you meant, but it does contribute to sort of a narrative, right, about the state.
Yeah.
And that is not exactly true. Go back to Massachusetts. Massachusetts actually has very strong enclaves of Republican vote as well.
Right. I mean, it's an artificial division because, you know, there is no state where 100% of the voters vote Democratic or they vote Republican. Like it doesn't exist. And there's this sort of notion that, you know, we're divided along those lines. And it's, you know, you know, Joe Biden was not my choice, but I hope that he wins every electoral vote. And I hope that he is able to use that scale of a victory to, you know, I don't know, calm people down or something. I mean, it's really frustrating. I would imagine that Europe would be pretty disappointed in us recently. Is that fair?
Well, let me say that there was a poll that was conducted 2 or 3 weeks ago. They conducted every 4 years, every time that the United States have a US election. Who would you vote for if you could vote in the United States? And the overwhelming majority of Europeans, even the ones in the more conservative or thought of conservative Eastern states like Poland and Hungary, overwhelmingly would have selected Joe Biden as, I mean, overwhelmingly Joe Biden as the president. And I know that, you know, some Trump supporters may look at that and think, oh, it's because Trump is weak, you know, or Trump has been tough on Europe. I mean, you know, everything is on the eye of the beholder to some extent, but that doesn't seem to be what motivates and worries the Europeans in particular. The other thing that I also thought was really interesting, I think this came out last week, but a different poll was conducted across Europe, and only about 10%, in fact, I think under 10% of Europeans thought that we were about to have free and fair elections in the United States. And if you think about that perception, it's incredible. You know, it's incredible that our longest and strongest allies, the other advanced democracies in the world, are looking at us and saying, well, that their population anyway is looking at us and saying, we don't think your elections will be fair.
No, and they're right. I mean, you know, it is objectively true that the reputation of the United States has always been better than we actually deserved. Not to say that there aren't good things that we did. You know, helping to defeat German militarism in World War I is a good thing. Helping to defeat the Nazis in World War II and Japanese fascism, that was a good thing. We have done good things. But our internal system has always been really awful. And, you know, as I said in the joint lecture that we've given, which by the way is on our YouTube channel, so you, the viewer, can go watch it next. It's called My Vote, My Voice. So do that next. It's always been dysfunctional. We had about 10 years where things were okay. Things were pretty good, you know, and then the Reagan Revolution comes in and they begin to undo all of that. And that was on purpose because they were, you know, you had in the 70s and 80s in the United Kingdom, in the United States, you had a group of people coming into power called neoliberals. They knew that neoliberalism was a joke. I mean, it's you know, it doesn't make sense on its surface. So they had to polarize the society. They had to destroy the educational system. They had to do all of that just to impose this awful economic system, which has ruined us. I mean, it's insanity that any of this happened. And so, and we did end up in the, you know, as I said earlier, we did end up at a dead end, you know, and maybe, well, let me say this. Let's say, and I'm going to knock on wood right now, but let's say that Biden wins in a landslide, and let's say that things calm down and things begin to improve just over time, right? I absolutely 100% believe that everyone in the world is going to be willing to say, okay, we'll forget the last 4 years, no problem. Let's just go back to normal. I really do that. But I also think if we take the wrong path.
I'm not sure that there's a go back to normal moment. Like I do agree with you that the relationship with our allies can still be patched up and brought normalized again. I would agree with you on that. But the new normal will look different from what it would have looked like, 4 and 10 years ago, so to say. But as you were speaking, I was thinking about, what I saw as the big fracture moments, the big divisions. The Europeans and the Americans used to be very much on the same page up until the 1990s, I would say. There were always issues, even during the Cold War, that, the Europeans and the Americans didn't align against, Israel being one of them, in which the Europeans always took a very different line from the US. But that it was never enough to really put a damper on the relationship, certainly during the Cold War. The 1990s, you were talking about, the projection of US power in the world and Americans being liked. And it was true, like in the 1990s, I managed to actually fulfill one of my dreams of childhood, which was to come to the United States. I always wanted to be in the United States. So when my parents actually decided that we were immigrating, right, I was, yes, it was really the culmination of a great dream. But, in part because I really saw the United States, as I think many people of my generation did in Europe, as a great place to be at, a place of industry, of innovation, in which you could really be whatever you wanted to be, leave your old baggage behind and start again. This was really at least the image I had. It was an exciting place, right? It was a place of growth, and a lot of that started to take a turn by the late 90s. But I think 9/11, right? 9/11 was like the last big wave of support for the United States.
Yeah.
And the Europeans were really side by side with the Americans when it came to Afghanistan. And then you start to see that big fracture regarding Iraq, right? And it's not a fracture that the Europeans have forgotten. The overwhelmingly, with some exceptions, the UK being one of them, right? But most European states, and certainly most European citizens, did not agree with, the Europeans participating in the war in Iraq, or the United States going to the war in Iraq. And from there on, right, there has been, I think, great damage done to that image of the United States as necessarily just a force for good in the world, or a force for democracy in the world. That narrative has been, which was a very strong narrative in the 1990s, that's been greatly weakened. And I think Trump could be a death knell on that narrative altogether, because of his sort of nativist, nationalistic return to navel gazing, right? And forgetting about the allies. Pressures about NATO, pressures about the divisions about the environment. The Europeans we are literally from different planets when it comes to thinking about the environment and thinking about climate change. And the fact that that's an issue that is contentious at all, or polarized at all in the United States, really is bewildering, for the average European. It's a non-matter. In fact, it's only a matter in the sense that there's a sense of urgency, both by European elites and European citizens, about climate change and being proactive about it. So stepping out of NATO, would be a big deal, but stepping out of the World Health Organization, stepping out of the Paris Climate Agreement, that is, again, it's truly bewildering from a European point of view. So some of those things can, of course, be repaired, but
no, it's a great point. Like it's the last 20 years have done tremendous damage. They just have, to our reputation, to the country. It's just, the Republicans were allowed to steal the election in 2000, and it's been downhill since then. And the reality is that Barack Obama didn't do enough to repair that damage, and he didn't do enough to appeal. He was you know, let me backtrack for a moment. There was early in his presidency, the Republicans in Congress invited him to speak before them. So he went and he talked in front of them, and it was televised, and he blew them out of the water. I mean, he destroyed them so badly in that conference, they never would do it again, right? What I never understood is why he wasn't on television every week doing exactly the same thing. And he just didn't do it. Mm-hmm. So he, I think, is, and the other thing that's really frustrating for me is that there are things that he did that I like, and there are things that he did that I don't. But we could never have a rational conversation about the man because we were fighting about birth certificates and death panels. So, you know, you end up with this, Obama was great. Well, okay. I mean, you know, he was great in that we didn't completely collapse into chaos while he was president, which, you know, we might be about to do in a few days because of Trump. So he never did enough. So what the only little glimmer of tiny little bit of hope that I have, because I really do think that most Americans are really angry at Trump and really angry at everything that's happened, which is a good motivator, unfortunately. And what all we can hope for is that the backlash against Trump is big enough that we can begin to sort of get back to rational stuff. But I think it's going to take, you know, groups like Better Elections Now or BU Votes or all these groups, like, we're going to have to keep going. Like, we're going to have to keep saying, okay, we have lots to fix. We can't disengage just because Joe Biden wins in a landslide, knock on wood, you know, whether he does or not, but I don't know. So we're rapidly running out of time. Can I jump to the 270towin.com website?
Please do.
And we'll come back and have a minute to wrap up. But I want to show everybody this phenomenal website called 270towin.com. And it allows you to play around with the Electoral College. So I thought we might take a look at this. And again, this is November 1st, so we don't know the outcome. We have both multiple times knocked on wood. This is not a prediction, it's just a what if, okay, everybody? So don't get sick with anxiety. So, well, here's what I'll do. I'm gonna show you what I think is likely. And I think Arizona likely is going, oh, you know what? I have to switch the view. Let me go to the polling map. So this is the map that shows you what the polls are saying at the moment. So I definitely think Maine goes entirely for Biden. I think North Carolina will go for Biden. I think Florida will go for Biden. Arizona, I think definitely will go for Biden. And then we come down to these four. I think Iowa stays Trump. I think I really want to put Texas in Biden's column because, like, as of yesterday, I think 109% of the people that voted in 2016 have voted in Texas.
Yeah, it's incredible. The turnout in Texas has been unbelievable. And I don't know, but the one thing I would caution is that turnout has been high on both sides, Republican and Democrat.
Yeah. So
it's a high turnout year because both sides are mobilized.
Yes, and it's going to be, Republican turnout will be very high on Tuesday. And that's actually, you know, that's one of the things that worries me, that, you know, he's going to look good on election night and start screaming that it's being stolen. And I'm worried about that.
I think even the Republican Party is worried about that. Everyone is worried about the president not accepting the results, whatever they are, right?
I know, it's insanity. And then we come down to these three. So, like, do you have any reason to think that the ones I've given to Biden are—
Sorry, which three are you talking about?
So I gave North Carolina, Florida, and Arizona. I've given those to Biden. Mm-hmm. And then we're just left with these three. Any thoughts on Ohio or Georgia or Texas?
I suspect Ohio is going to go Trump.
I'm on that train.
This is just gut feelings, right? Because statistically, it's really hard to tell right now in this state.
It is.
I suspect Ohio is going to go Trump. One of the reasons I suspect it is that early turnout has been much weaker in Ohio than in other places. Mm-hmm. But we'll see. And Texas, I suspect, will stay red as well. Mm-hmm. stories. I don't know if you heard the story this morning about Dallas and that, what is it, 127,000 ballots might be thrown out if the judge rules in favor of the Republican Party, who are claiming that the drive-through station that the Electoral Commission had set up was not legal within the state. So, and we're talking about a place that is highly diverse, and we know that turnout has been high, in particular amongst minority communities, like with the African American communities and whatnot. So, I don't know. You know, one county might make the difference in Texas. That's.
I agree.
So,
I do think that Nebraska, one of theirs is going to go for. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Well, Nebraska has one electoral vote that I'm pretty sure will go for Biden. I should have added that.
I haven't been looking too carefully at Nebraska, but Florida is, you know, the story is similar to Texas. I think Florida is leaning Biden, and to turnout, it's been very exciting to see that turnout amongst African Americans has also been very, very high in Florida, like comparable to 2008 numbers. And if Biden is going to win Florida, Biden's going to need to turn out the same type of people that Obama turned out both times. And that means a large percentage of the Latino vote and a high mobilization of the African-American vote as well. So we'll see. But Florida is the state that I am most nervously looking at in the entire election, because my sense is that if Florida, we will know pretty much 99% of the vote count by election night in Florida. I think that if Florida goes blue, it's going to create a sense of inevitability of a Biden win. But if it goes red, then we are going to have to wait for that northern Midwestern states, and it's going to be a tough fight in Pennsylvania. So
and then I do think with the turnout in Georgia, I think it's possible to go Biden, but I don't know the likelihood. But I guess we'll find out.
Georgia is a possibility. I mean, if Georgia goes blue, you know, if Georgia, if Florida goes red, but it's really close, right? Then we might have several recounts in Florida as well. But then if we see North Carolina and Georgia both go blue, well, you know, it's like there are multiple paths for victory for Biden without Florida, but not so many for Trump. Trump really needs Florida.
I don't know. I'm going to be so happy when this is all over. However, as my coffee is gone, our time is gone too. And I really, really want to thank you. I think this is a great conversation. I really appreciate
it. It was great fun.
You coming on, and we'll have to do it again. And you know, we're going to be Daniela and I both work as part of B Votes at my beloved Boston University, and we're going to continue to do that. And so we'll be doing more lectures together and things like that. So thank you again. I so appreciate it, and stay safe, and thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.